Okay, we have Wayne Castonguay here tonight from the Division of Marine Fisheries, and he has a presentation and an update for us on the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. We hope.
Wayne can have the center stage.
Good evening. While we get the computer and the slides going, I'd love to introduce the Deputy Director for the Division of Marine Fisheries, Robert Glenn, to my left, who's going to give an overview.
Okay. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening, Madam Chair and Select Board members. Very much appreciate you having us here tonight to talk a little bit about ongoing work the Division of Marine Fishery is doing across the state with looking at reclassification of shellfish growing areas that are adjacent to wastewater treatment plants. This is a program that we've initiated a few years ago, and we're working kind of municipality by municipality, following guidance and mandates from the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference through the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. That's a tongue twister. And with FDA guidance to essentially within that, there's a document called the Model Ordinance, which is a set of regulations and guidance on how to classify growing areas for shellfish relative to municipal waste. Within that, there is a mandate that every wastewater treatment plant has a buffer zone around it to essentially to protect that a buffer zone that prohibits the harvest of shellfish within that area. And so tonight, Wayne, who is our program manager for our shellfish program out of our Gloucester office on the North Shore. If I might also introduce staff, I have Dr. Chrissy Pettipass right there, who is our Assistant Director of Shellfish for the Division of Marine Fisheries, and for this town, our growing area biologist, Melissa Campbell, right there. And so with that tonight, Wayne would like to give you a brief presentation of a work that we've been doing in conjunction with the University of Massachusetts at Dartmouth and Dr. Chen. So with that, I'll give it to Wayne.
Okay, and thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Bob, for coming all the way up from New Bedford to assist us. So, really appreciate it. As Bob indicated, I'm going to give you a quick overview. Many of you have heard about this, particularly from the chief. He's been updating you. We've been waiting until we've had some preliminary results to share with you. Those results came in just a week and a half ago, and we got right on your agenda, so we're pleased to talk to you about what might happen here in Ipswich. What we're here to do is talk about what we call in our business designated shellfish growing area N5. Every growing area in the entire country has to be officially certified by what's called the National Shellfish Sanitation Program and have an official designation. Here in Massachusetts, we usually have a prefix here on the North Shore N, and area N5, which is the Ipswich River. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And as Bob and I indicated, shellfish harvesting and distribution and processing is governed by what's called the NSSP, which is the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, which is a national cooperative program among states, the federal government, and industry, and it governs the sanitary control of shellfish. Why is sanitation so important for shellfish? You guys are all from Ipswich, you know that answer, but for those people at home, shellfish are very unique in terms of their food source. They're filter feeders, so they concentrate contaminants in the environment up to 100 times in their bodies. So obviously if we eat and consume such filter feeders, they could be unsafe if they're grown in unhealthy waters. Also, there are naturally occurring contaminants as well, known as biotoxins. All of us know that as red tide here, so they can concentrate those toxins in their body. And then the second reason why we need this program, and it's so strict in terms of public health, is shellfish, as you all know, most often are consumed raw. So those two reasons call for this program, and shellfish, to no one's surprise, is the most regulated form of food in America. Every DSGA, designated shellfish growing area in the country, falls into one of these 5 classifications based on the sanitary quality of the growing water, as we call it, that they live in. So based on the level of pollution, The first area in green's approved. That means shellfish can be harvested for direct human consumption. So you can take the shellfish right out of the water and consume it without any control. Another area in the blue is called conditionally approved. That means they're safe to eat some of the time, and there are conditions, predictable conditions, that cause the water to be temporarily unsafe. And most of the waters here in Ipswich are conditional, and most of us are familiar with our rain closures and seasonal closures, things of the like. So conditionally approved shellfishing is what's most familiar to those of us here in Ipswich. Then there's an intermediate classification called restricted. Those are areas that have a limited amount of contamination most of the time. We fortunately here in Ipswich do not have any of those areas. Those areas tend to be like the Merrimack River and Boston Harbor. Again, we don't need to worry about those here in Ipswich. Then finally, red, prohibited. That means shellfish cannot be harvested for any purpose for human consumption. The only thing you can do with them is transplant them as seed or harvest juvenile shellfish from those areas. So look at the red, the green, and the blue on this chart, because that's what we'll be talking about for the rest of the presentation.
Can I just ask one question? Back to that other slide. So years ago, wasn't the Ipswich River under either restricted or conditionally restricted because the clammers had to take their clams to the deporation plant in Newburyport?
That's right. Very, very good memory, Linda. We did have restricted areas here. The Ipswich River, as Linda indicated, was restricted. However, we have been very successful at cleaning up the river over the years, so it got reclassified in 2001 to conditionally approved.
And I think that's an important distinction for what we're going to be talking about coming up.
Very good. So the slide I showed, the second slide, was the actual manual, as we call it, the NSSP guide. It really consists of the regulations and what in the NSSP can be analogous to the laws governing this whole program. And what's shown on the slide here, you'll see highlighted a lot of shalls. And sitting next to the chief here, we all know what the shall means when we're talking about legal responsibility. These are non-negotiable things you must do. And there's three on the slide here that basically, as Bob said in his preface, that a prohibited area shall be established next to every outfall. And then you shall take into all of these variables in determining the size of that prohibited area. And then finally, adjacent to the prohibited area, you shall have a conditional area beyond that where those conditions are subject to plant performance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And really what we're here about tonight is in the guidance, which is the second half of the manual on page 287. Guidance, a lot of people think by the nature of the term, is optional. Well, in the NSSP, it really is not optional. I like to call the guidance the regulations. The model ordinance is the law, when the guidance is analogous to the regulations. These are things that the conference has established as the way you should do business. And to overcome that guidance is a Herculean task. And so we're going to be talking about that task here tonight. One thing to point out, though, is the shall slide before here is there's a minimum size that the prohibited zone needs to be that you cannot go below. And we're going to be talking mostly about that for the rest of the talk. This is a hypothetical display, a graphical display of what we just talked about. So up here is a theoretical wastewater outfall, and then there needs to be a prohibited zone where shellfish can never be harvested, and that's essentially based on the dilution of the effluent. And the minimum in the manual is basically 1,000 to 1. So you need 1,000 gallons of clean water to dilute every gallon of effluent, and that area is the presumptive prohibited zone. And then beyond that, this blue, and again in Ipswich we have a lot of blue areas, this is the conditional area. And that basically, according to the manual, is 100,000 gallons to 1. And the reason it's so large is they assume that treatment plants fail, and every treatment plant fails even for a couple of minutes, or it could be catastrophic, for example, in the event of a fire or a natural disaster. So the purpose of the conditional area is to be able to notify shell fishermen, get them off the flats before that contamination could reach the growing area. So that's what goes into the conditionally approved determination. And then, of course, outside that is the green, outside the 100,000 to 1 line that can be harvested even if the plant is closed. So that's basically just a graphical display of what we're talking about. So what does this all mean for us here in Ipswich? This is a map of growing area, designated growing area N5, which is the Ipswich River, essentially everything from freshwater out to the mouth of the river, a direct line between Little Neck and the breakwater on Crane Beach. Everything upstream of that is N5. And you can see, as I said earlier, lots of red, lots of green, and lots of blue. Right now, upstream area is prohibited, and that's because pollutants usually come to shellfishing areas from upstream, up rivers, and also Ipswich River goes right through downtown and it picks up stormwater and other contaminants. So it's very typical for rivers. In fact, almost every river in Massachusetts has its upstream area prohibited. So that's not unusual. Here, N5.5, which is a sub-area, is the current prohibited zone around our treatment plant. For those of you who don't know, here's the outfall location. It's kind of in a weird location at the headwaters of Greenwood Creek, right on the trustee's property of Greenwood Farm, just off Jeffreys Neck Road. And if you look here to the left, here's our plant out in the woods on Fellows Road, and they have a pipe directly out to the marsh here. And so that's the discharge. So we've calculated that for decades as this area in red here. And we're going to hear tonight that that area just is too small. And we'll talk more about what that means. And then in between the blue area, this area of the river is open to shellfishing, and it has 3 conditions on it. Not only the plant performance, as we've already talked about, but also rainfall. The river, as we know, closes if it rains for over a 1/4 inch or more. And that's, again, because the stormwater runoff contaminates the flats. And then there's a 3rd condition in the Ipswich River, or N5, and that's seasonal. It's only open in the winter or colder months because in the summertime, it does not meet shellfishing standards. So it's only open in the wintertime, which we'll talk about more. And then out here, of course, we have area N6, which is Crane Beach, and that's approved. Area N3, which is the ocean side of Plum Island, that's approved. And then our main shellfishing areas, N4, which is all of Plum Island Sound, and not shown on the map is down here, Back Beach or Essex Bay, which is area N7. So we're really talking about our 3 conditional areas, N5, N4, N7, which make up all of our shellfishing harvesting in Ipswich.
And I think N4 is the largest area for our clammers.
That's right.
Yeah.
About 80%, 75% comes from N4.
Right.
So we've long had a prohibited area around the plant. It's been a requirement by the NSSP since its inception. But what they didn't have is strict guidance on how big to calculate that. So historically, we've determined it by these 2 studies here. One on the left is we did an extensive dye and drogue study with the FDA ourselves back in the 90s before we reopened the river to clamming. And the town itself did this report in the middle here in 2015 with its consultant. All wastewater plants have to do modeling for their other discharge permits. So this is a pretty current model that ICAM did on behalf of the wastewater plant. And so we combined those 2 studies to come up with the existing closure zone here in Greenwood and Diamond Stage Creeks. And then on the right, we institutionalize in what we call a CAMP, which is an acronym for Conditional Area Management Plan, which is essentially an MOU that we have with the town, and the chief and the constable know this very well, where we collectively agree to jointly manage this area according to the sanitary conditions that we set out. And then the town, under that MOU, is free to manage the shell fishery under local control like any town in Massachusetts. So all this has been in existence for years and years under the camp, and what we're talking about now is a change to that old condition. So as we talk about the change that we're proposing and sharing with you tonight, the big challenge, and you've all heard the adage, dilution is the solution to pollution. Well, here in the Ipswich River, this is aerial of the river at low tide, you can see there's almost no water in our river. All of us, I think, are boaters. We know the river very well. There's just no water in our river at low tide. And because the discharge is into such a shallow estuary, the dilution just isn't there, and it's a big concern, and that's really the root of the problem here. Before we talk about the potential changes we're contemplating, I want to just give you some context. I think many of you know many of these facts, but for those of you who may not be as familiar, N5 is, as we talked about, a fairly recent addition to our shell fishing acreage in Ipswich. It's only been harvested for direct sale for about 15 years, largely as a result of the great pollution cleanup the town did in the 1990s. And so it's a bonus area to the town. That said, it's still very important. On the pie chart here, you can see on average over the last 5 years, about 15% of the total harvest comes from the river during the winter months, and the rest, the remaining 85%, comes from area N7 and N4, so Plum Island Sound and Essex Bay. As I said earlier, it's only open in the winter time. This percentage, though, however, has been increasing recent years because as the shellfish population has been reduced in areas 4 and 7, the harvesters have been depending on the river more and more because it's only open for a few months of the year, so that resource tends to last longer there. And so this news we're going to talk about is going to be particularly hard because the diggers have been really interested in getting back in the river this winter. So that's just the context.
So I just wanted to point out 2023, I think the reason the numbers were so low was because it was a very wet year and we had a lot of rainfall closures that year.
That's correct. And then the last qualifier that I want to point out is recreationally. Obviously, we're a huge recreational shellfishing community as well. The river itself does not contribute hardly at all to the recreational fishery. It's just not desirable. It's only open in the winter. It's hard to get an access to the flats there, and there's much easier digging and access in N4 and N7. So we're really talking about commercial shellfishing only here tonight. Please don't dive into this slide. There's way too much here, but the question we get all the time is why now? And this really goes into great detail why now, but I'll just real quickly touch on this. The NSSP established the specific criteria that I showed in slide number 3 back in 2015. And as Bob indicated at the beginning, DMF has been really working systematically across the state. There's about 12 plants that discharge near open shellfishing areas in the Commonwealth, and we're about number 6 that the division has been dealing with. And the reason it's taken so long is to refute the 1,000-to-1 assumption in the model ordinance. You need an incredible amount of data, a lot of sophisticated analysis, and that can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars for each plant to obtain. And so we've been petitioning the legislature for that funding, and we're able to only do about 1 or 2 of these a year. So that's why it's taken from 2015 to today. And the real trigger why we're here tonight and why in Ipswich is every growing area across the country has to be audited by the federal government, the FDA, every 15 years or so. And this year they chose N5. And so in August, the FDA was here with Matt and the chief and all of us out in all of our growing areas in Ipswich. And no surprise to us, they cited us as having an inadequate dilution analysis for the wastewater plant here in Ipswich. So we agreed in our response to keep the area closed until we could get the results from all of our studies and analysis, which we kicked off last year, and it's taken about a year to get enough data and enough modeling to be able to come tonight and tell you what that's starting to look like. Just want to give you a quick look about what this might look like for us here in Ipswich. This is the very first reevaluation we did statewide. This is down in Scituate and Marshfield in the North and South Rivers. The exact situation is here in Ipswich. The North River is about the same size as the Ipswich River. The shell fishing habitat is very similar. A lot of beach, a lot of river. And the wastewater plant discharge is right up here at the head of a tidal creek, way out in the marsh, just near the river, just like the plant here in Ipswich, and it happens to be about the same size plant. So the situation is very analogous, and this is what we can expect here in Ipswich, something like this. All said and done, this orange area is the newly classified prohibited zone associated with the Situate plant. And you can see before that, it didn't even exist. There's just this old red lines here in the upper river, and the creek up here taking the discharge, just like Greenwood Creek here in Ipswich was prohibited. And after the modeling effort, this large, more than half of the estuary had to be closed permanently because of the requirements of the NSSP, that 321 minimum closure area. Luckily here in Situate, their plant is a really operating plant. We had great relationship, so we were able to get to the minimum of 320 to 1 here. But you can still see a large percentage of the estuary had to be closed, which is what we thought we could see here.
Were those areas that are now closed down there, were those active shellfish beds that were open all the time?
They too were just a seasonal area, just like the Ipswich River. Again, rivers and shellfishing are hard to combine because of the upland runoff and the freshwater input. And so this area was only a winter shell fishery, just like here in Ipswich, but also it's recreational only. They don't have any commercial shell fishing there. So in terms of industry impacts, it wasn't nearly as significant as we're talking about here. It was just the opposite. Here we don't have any recreational shell fishing, but we have commercial, so it's just the opposite. So the big crescendo that I'm building here to is just a couple of weeks ago, week and a half to be exact, we got the first results of the modeling. Statewide, as Bob indicated, we partnered with the University of Massachusetts down in Dartmouth, who currently is known for the best hydrodynamic marine modeling in the country. It's used by everybody. It's really the Cadillac of hydrodynamic models. And so we went right to the source to contract them. They did this Situate model. They've also done modeling for us in New Bedford and New Haven. And now they're modeling Ipswich and Dartmouth on the South Shore at the same time. So we went to the best. Again, we wanted to have the best information, and so we could go to the FDA with our analysis, and so that we could be basically protected from anyone refuting the analysis. And this model, believe it or not, takes about a year per plant, as I said, to run. It takes 10 months of data collection and data entry, and then for every scenario, it takes about 5 full days on a supercomputer to run just 1 month of data. And so we got that first month last week and a half ago. And so this is what that first month looks like. They did January, and why January? One is that's when the river is open, so we wanted the first model run to represent a season that the river is open, but obviously beginning of the calendar year as well. But it's also the month of the year, January, February, that has the most wind and also the biggest tides. So the combination of big tides and a lot of wind really affects how the wastewater plume moves through our estuary. So we started with January. And the 3 colors here are blue is the 1,000 to 1 line. Remember, the 1,000 to 1 line is the standard. And you can go below that, but you have to have an incredible argument to refute the 1,000 to 1 standard. And then the minimum is this red, which is 320 to 1. Why 320 to 1? That's actually the national standard used by the EPA and the CDC around all wastewater plants, that you must have a minimum dilution before you can even permit a discharge. I know the folks here in Ipswich are very familiar with that. That ICAM model that we did in 2015 here in Ipswich was basically to determine that 320 line for the EPA permit that we have here in Ipswich. So the model ordinances allows us, with an incredible amount of data, to get between the 320 and the 1,000 to 1. And that's really what we're trying to do here in Ipswich. But you can see the 1,000 to 1 is a huge area. It goes all the way up into N4. basically even beyond Rowley, and then off, well off in the open ocean off of Crane Beach. I think I wouldn't say a surprise, but we were expecting an output similar to Scituate, where much of the estuary or some of the estuary could be salvaged. If you look here, and for those that, I know this is a terrible map, but here's Great Neck, Little Neck, Castle Hill here, and so you can see the majority of N5, the Ipswich River, falls into the red area, and this is a worst-case scenario in terms of the month of the year. The other months might be a little better, but I just wanted to plant the seed here that we're talking about a not-so-great news story here. We've still got a long way to go. We're going to get the remaining months by the end of the calendar year, and we think it might improve a little bit, but probably not significant. So we're here to say tonight we should begin preparing for this outcome. And I just want to point out here, this area of green and blue here, this is a very important part of the river as well. Treadwell Island Creeks and Fox Creek, which historically have been among the most productive parts of the river. There is some hope that we could salvage those creeks as well, which would be a pretty good news story if we could do that. Again, this is preliminary, it's too soon, but there's a glimmer of hope for those two areas. And why I showed the surface and bottom here in hydrodynamic modeling, particularly with wastewater and effluent, the surface and the bottom water are very different. Effluent is fresh water, and it's lighter, so it floats on top of the surface of the seawater, and that really has a dramatic impact on how this mixes and moves throughout the estuary. And the model takes all of that into account, including the wind, the tide, the salinity, the river flow, on an hourly basis. That's why it takes so long to run it. And this just shows the average for January. So bottom line, this is what we're here to share. As we said earlier, we think the existing prohibited zone is too small, and in this case, it's quite a bit too small. If we were to follow the base guidance of 1,000 to 1, we'd be even talking about a much larger area, but I really want to emphasize how good the Ipswich wastewater plant is. It's among the best operating plants in the entire state. The staff there, Vicki Hellman, their crew has been incredible. They've been working with us for the last year, giving us unprecedented access to sampling. So we're gathering this data, putting it into the model. And so we think, because of how good Ipswich is, we can get to that 321 minimum. So in some ways, this is a good news presentation based on how good the Ipswich plant is operating. Again, we don't have the outcome yet. We do think that now that the data is rolling in, we can be in position to make this decision as soon as January. So we're rolling right around. The next few weeks are going to be critical. We'll be crunching the numbers, working with UMass, our whole team, and talking to Vicki and her team over the next month to be in a position to make this reclassification in January. And I just want to end with, we understand it's really tough news and it's going to be impactful, but we are working on lots of initiatives that could at least blunt some of this impact. A couple examples could be, one, we're really reevaluating our rainfall criteria for all of Ipswich and N4. As many of you know, N4 closes for 8 days following certain events right now. We're reevaluating that right now to get at least some of these days back. Also, potentially, Fox and Treadwells could be open for longer in the season as well, so that's another initiative we're working on. I think that's going to take a little more time, but hopefully that can blunt some of this impact to the commercial fishers. So with that, I'll wind down, and we'd love to answer any questions.
So the first one I have is, has it been discussed about if the closure area is not always closed and maybe the clammers can go back to the deporation plant? I don't even know if that's still open. I've heard stories, it was closed for a while and I'm not sure if it's reopened, but is that a possibility that?
It's a question all the time, and maybe Bob and Chrissy can help me with the statewide perspective. We get that all the time.
Yeah, so that, and Chrissy, jump in anytime here in case I misspeak, because Chrissy is really our expert on the model ordinance. But essentially, for clams to go into the depuration fishery and brought to the clam plant in Newburyport, they have to come from an area which is conditionally restricted or a moderately contaminated area. The closure area around a wastewater treatment plant has to be prohibited. So anything that falls within a prohibited zone does not qualify for depuration. To confound that, currently the depuration plant is not open. The seawater wellheads that feed the plant, actually it's salt well water from beneath the actual Plum Island itself, were knocked out by a coastal storm last January and then have continued to just erode. And we actually, was it January, December, we had the plant itself got inundated for a few days with seawater. And so we're in the process of making decisions on the long-term future of that plant that I don't have an answer to tonight, but
Okay.
that's another consideration. But in general, even if the plant were fully operational, the prohibited area around the wastewater treatment plant does not qualify for a depuration fishery.
So what are there even any options for assistance from the federal government or the state to help mitigate the consequences of this?
That's a great question that I don't particularly have answers to right now. It's hard to, right now, we're not sure what the extent of the impact is going to be. I think once we get a better idea, we get the final model results, we look at, as Wayne said, and can take into consideration the excellent performance of the wastewater treatment plant here in Ipswich, and we come up with, it's a fine balance. We're talking about protecting human health here, and so it's like a fine balance between wanting to provide ample opportunity for both commercial interest and recreational interest, but still protecting the citizens of the Commonwealth from eating contaminated shellfish. And so it's a fine balance where we don't want to give the impression that we just automatically run to the bare minimum, because if there are good reasons not to do that, we don't. But we take it all into consideration. In this case, Ipswich is an excellent performing plant. Wayne, as Wayne said, looking at all the information, and we'll take all that into consideration and look at the dilution contours and come up with what our suggested closure area will be. Once that happens, we'll have a better idea of what the impact will be, and then, from our division, at that point we would, obviously look to talk to our superiors up the chain and see if there are other opportunities. I'm not sure if there's any federal assistance for this or not. That would be premature for me to speak tonight on that.
So, all right, so you expect to have more information in January, at which point would you be coming back to us to update us?
Yes, we would be happy to come back at your convenience and update the select board on what our findings are.
Okay.
Can I just ask one quick follow-on, just to confirm the impact analysis you discussed, impact of whatever the new closure recommendations turn out to be, that's part of the DMF work? That's something you would conduct and present?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Other questions, Sarah?
So when you come back in January, I know you mentioned a couple of factors that might help mitigate this worst-case scenario. Are there other things that other communities have done? Will some of those recommendations come to, or because this is relatively new, are other communities looking for other potential solutions?
You want to take that, Wayne? Or?
New technologies as they build new wastewater treatment
Yeah,
plants, those types of things?
Unfortunately, the reason for the minimum prohibited zone are for deleterious substances that are typically not treated. So things like PFAS, microplastics, pharmaceuticals. There's a whole group of substances that aren't typically removed in wastewater. So we're always going to have that minimum zone. So I'm not sure that technology could help us. I hate to say it tonight, but the town has talked about relocating its outfall many times, so maybe this could give a little impetus to some grand solutions such as that. I think the other things that are more likely are things I already mentioned, things like, first of all, minimizing the area, maybe as the river continues to improve water quality-wise, some of the areas not impacted by the minimum zone could be opened for longer to help mitigate that. And then again, the big one is reassessing our rain policy and the other open areas.
Can I ask another question, follow up on that? Just, would it be, I have no idea what the financial feasibility of relocation of an outfall would be. I'm sure it's expensive, maybe prohibitively so, but is that something your group would undertake as some kind of analysis, both to understand where it could be relocated to in order to minimize the impact?
It's probably not us, Carl. That's certainly EPA, DEP, as well as the locals, the watershed associations, groups of that nature. I know the town has looked at it off and on for years. Again, this is why I didn't want to bring it up, and I shouldn't have. But it's viable. It's just an expensive proposition. But we could certainly advise on where not to put it or where to put it. The probably only open avenue, though, is upstream into freshwater because we are in an ocean sanctuary. So moving it offshore is probably not part of the answer, but moving it upstream is probably the only path.
Okay.
But I mean, maybe even funding for a feasibility study to look into that could be acquired from the feds or the state, so we at least know what that would look like if that were to be something that the town would invest in. Because that was one of my first thoughts too, looking at this, saying, well, what if we just moved the outflow pipe? And, what would that look like and how would that change the impacted areas, if at all? I have a quick request for the next time that you guys come before us. Could you go back to slide number 7, which is the current classification of area N5, that one. Could you, this was actually very helpful as a visual person, such as myself. Could you put what the new colors will look like under worst case scenario, basically expanded where the red and the blue would be?
Same map.
Yeah.
Same map, just with the newer?
Yeah, so you get the same
Locations.
perspective.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, we'll definitely do that. The first simple preliminary January run was just so preliminary, we wouldn't do that, but certainly in January, we'll have very detailed maps.
That'd be great.
I thought there was something, maybe I was just thinking I saw it, that there was a map, I don't know if it was in color like this, of the potential closures.
Yeah, that was,
Yeah, that was
It's towards the end,
this one here.
that one, yeah.
It's just so hard because it shows the high tide line and it's an aerial
Yeah.
photo.
we can take that information and put it on a similar map with the growing area designations so you could
Great.
see a side by side.
That'd be excellent, thank you.
Yeah, and what designates N5 and N4.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah.
But can I ask on that, can you characterize here tonight, just based on what you told us, referring back to the map we were looking at, what the current worst-case scenario looks like?
If we were to translate to this map, area N50, 53, and 54, and 56 would probably be closed, leaving 51. That's still potential to salvage.
And those would be permanently closed.
Year-round.
Be around.
Permanent.
Yes,
Comment
please.
and go back to your question about,
can
sorry,
you-
Christian Petapass.
Yeah, I was going to say move the microphone
Thank you.
down, thanks.
You questioned if you could commission a feasibility study and what have other towns done. There is an alternative to an ocean outfall. It's some discharge to sand beds, which end up being groundwater discharge. I don't know if this is feasible for your community, but I know Plymouth has done that where they already had some sand beds for discharge, but what they did was they made it so that they chose to utilize those sand beds more than the ocean outfall, so it minimized the volume that we then have to dilute. So if that was an option, if you did commission a feasibility study, that could be another thing to ask for, the feasibility of sand bed, groundwater-based discharge, because if it isn't an ocean discharge, we don't have to dilute it with, waters from the shellfish growing area.
And who would we get that information? Like, who would we apply to do that?
Do the feasibility study.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the contractors who would do that.
I think you're saying, who would we apply to receive funding assistance to do the feasibility study is what we're
And who would do such a feasibility study?
Right? I wish I had those answers for you. I do not.
I can get back to you on that. There's a whole group of consultants that do the work, and as Chrissy indicated, Plymouth has done it for that very reason, so they'd be happy to work with the town, I'm sure.
What's a sand bed?
It's like a giant leach field that has appropriate deposits to take that wastewater.
Dump it in the dunes, no, I'm kidding.
Yeah, you might not have
I don't think we do.
an upland source for it.
Charlie? Okay. Other questions?
Just curious on the sand bed, are we talking about use an existing feature, or is that something that could be created?
As long as the subsurface soil is supportable for like a septic system, then you could build the sand above that, or you could already, like in Plymouth, it was ready-made. Plymouth is all sand anyway. And there's a few spots here in Ipswich that would probably work.
Okay. All right, it's not a public hearing, but I do want to recognize the Shellfish Constable. Are you there to ask questions, Matt?
I have one question for you.
Okay, do you want to?
So Matt Bodwell, National Resource Officer for the Police Department. Wayne, I just had one question. If we close N5.0 and 4 and .3, would we be able to transport those to like the shellfish to N4 safely to have them grow there so the guys wouldn't lose out? Is that a possibility?
Unfortunately, as I said earlier, Matt, the prohibited classification really does not allow much option in terms of shellfish. You can move seed, so under a certain size you could move that, not adult shellfish. So that's probably the only potential use, the real small stuff.
I'm only asking because it's going to be a huge, huge loss, so, okay, thank you.
So Matt, is your question, can I ask you,
Yeah.
is your question could we
Relocate.
concentrate the seed in the non-N5 areas? Is that what your question is?
So my question was, so even any shellfish, if in those areas, if we could transplant them to like N4, N7? Now, and then, so we could save them, so the guys and gals would be able to dig them and have a future with shellfishing.
Technically, we haven't reclassified it.
I know, it's a large undertaking, and we would have to get people willing to do that, but it's a thought to get them out now before this area closes and they die off and they become useless.
The other consideration, just to remember, I'm not an expert on this either, but my understanding is that I'm not sure how viable are shellfish clams at being replanted. I know like hard clams, like cohogs, you can dig them and relay them in new areas. I don't know if soft shells would that be as successful, Chrissy, or? Yeah.
Yeah,
So just something to consider.
Different soils.
But if we have seed, if there's seed in the area, that's more viable to move, yeah, so.
Can you go to a microphone, please? Thank you. There'll be a lot of clamors watching this
Shellfish
segment.
Constable, and as the town, I think you have applied for a municipal shellfish permit. Correct. So you could harvest seed, but we're talking very, very small shellfish that you would have to transplant, and, you dig them out, they're a little more vulnerable to predation, depends on the time of year. We're thinking you wouldn't be very successful, but it doesn't mean you couldn't try.
Yeah, softshell clams by the nature, they're really fragile, and they typically don't transplant very well unless they're really small. Other species are much more likely to be successful.
But for future years, could we stack those other areas? Right? We couldn't we?
You could propagate those
Propagate,
areas,
thank you.
yes, and help supplement the natural recruitment into that area.
Okay. But then those are the areas that are hard to shellfish in the winter, right?
Well, that's,
It's not the river areas, right? They're
That's-
harder to access.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
yeah. And that's, the benefit of having the river open during the winter months is it's more protected for our harvesters. They're not having to go out in the open ocean. They go out of the wharf to the river. So,
Madam Chair, I have a quick question for either our chief or our constable. How big of an impact will this have, both for commercial and recreation?
So, only being in this position for about 2.5 years, so they say 15%, it's gonna be huge. So those guys and gals go out every day when it's open, and they come back with 300 pounds. No questions asked. They can go out and dig a half a tide and come back with 300 pounds. It's a significant financial loss for these folks, and it's a significant loss for the industry.
Yeah, what's important to remember is it is the 15%, but in the winter months, if you look at, that's where the majority of our clammers are going to and from, because it's safer, it's easier to dig, it's only open during that time, and it helps alleviate the pressure on the other areas as well during the winter, so.
So it gives area N4 and N7 time,
Yeah,
so if they get seeded, it gives them time to grow, and they don't get touched, they get left alone.
Right.
So it is
So
an impact.
It'll be a financial impact to the clammers this winter, future winters, but it's also gonna put more stress on the other areas in town.
which,
And-
as we heard a couple of weeks ago, we're in a down cycle right now anyway. And the river, my understanding is the river is loaded with clams,
Yes.
so.
And again, this is something that's coming from the federal government, and the state is using its resources to give the federal government the data needed to make the decision on the new classification. Am I kind of getting that right, on the chain of
Close.
command and the authority?
Close. No, essentially, the authority is us, it's Division of Marine Fishery, but like all shellfish authorities in the United States, we are participate and comply with the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, which develops the model ordinance as part of the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. And they basically set the standards that all states agree to abide by. If we are found not in conformance with those, we can get, I forget the exact terminology, but essentially the FDA can report us to the conference, and if we're found out of conformance, it prevents Massachusetts from selling any shellfish statewide across state lines. So like the penalty, though, the magnitude of the weight of not conforming with those is more than just the municipal effect. It actually affects interstate commerce for us.
Just if I may, on the bright side, say that we get, the 300 to 1, what would be the impact on the winter clamming? I mean, what percentage would we lose in that scenario?
Right, so I can't speak to that tonight, but that is the type of thing that we will try to provide when we come back with the full array, because we don't know exactly, after we've looked at all the information, where that 320 to 1 line is going to be. Once we know that, we can look at the potential implication based on our growing areas and try to estimate that for you.
Okay, question?
Yes.
So, Wayne, if you touched on this in the presentation and I missed it, I apologize, but, because you and I have talked about this before, but for everybody else, I certainly understand this rule for like oysters that you eat out of the out of the shell, but what about, post-harvest preparation, frying, steaming? Does that make a difference?
It does not. In this case, with these closure areas around wastewater treatment plant, it isn't just pathogens that they're concerned of. Obviously with a pathogen, you can cook it and kill the pathogen, and it could be safe to eat. A couple things is, one, we can't dictate what the consumers do with the shellfish after they bring it home, and so FDA looks at that and would frown upon that. But the other issue is these guidelines, the concept behind them is for things like catastrophic plant failure, like the plant fails and you're dumping raw sewage in, or somebody dumps industrial waste down a sewer line, or like some catastrophic issue. We want to make sure that there's enough receiving water to dilute those areas so that the shellfish there are safe to eat in the event that the plant fails. And that's what the FDA, that's what the pushback is going to be, to go below that. Anything below that 320 to 1, that's the EPA, the FDA, the CDC. That's like the human health standard for water quality that we can't eat, and we'll get pushback from FDA even backing up to that. We'll have to have a really strong argument as to why we're choosing to go instead of their recommendation of 1,000 to 1 to push it back all the way to the 320 to 1. That, as Wayne characterized it, that's a Herculean task, and we're willing to attempt to do that given the circumstances here, but we again, provide after we see all the information. But
Is there anything that we should be doing as a town to assist in that effort?
I think at this point, I think, keeping open dialogue with the division, we're happy to work with you. I've asked staff to make this work a priority, and they have, and we're working closely with the university and nudging the university to get those modeling results out. I think once, at this point, I think the best thing is to wait for us to get the results and come back to you and to kind of give you what the full landscape is. And then at that point, we can see what the options are.
And if I just could add to that, Charlie, as I indicated earlier, we've been working with Ipswich for about a year on this analysis, and just, I know I said it already, but just can't thank the staff enough. The town has been doing a tremendous amount, and we just want to thank everyone for helping out in this effort. And we know it's really hard, but it really takes a group effort, and just want to recognize all the success and the support we've had so far.
Yeah. If I may too, it's right back at you. We're fortunate to have a local involved in this who was totally willing to come here, and not willing, but eager to come here and share this information, even though it's not great news for our shell fishing community. We've gotten a lot of time and attention from the department, the state, and so I think it isn't great news, and I think it is gonna be impactful, but it won't be because we didn't try to try to get the best outcome possible in working with the state. So I want to thank. As soon as they had the first slice of modeling data ready, they wanted to get in front of all of you as soon as possible, and I want to give them credit. They could have said, "Well, let's get more data," but it was a priority for them to come here and present. So I want to thank them for that.
Yeah, I just want to add my thanks to that too. So you expect to have more information in January, and you'll come back to us then with all of that. And then my question is, after that meeting, would you be agreeable to meeting with or inviting our commercial clammers in?
Absolutely.
And doing a presentation and answering all of their questions?
We would be
Because
happy
I
to
think
do
that's
that.
going to be critical.
Understood, and we understand how impactful this can be and how sensitive of a topic is, but we'd be happy to come in and speak with the fishers.
So I envision this as you'll come back in January to meet with us and give us the rest of the information and your recommendations, and shortly after that, within a week or two, we'll have that open meeting for the clammers.
Absolutely.
When does the reclassification go into effect?
When we sign it, essentially. So it's like we essentially would come to a decision and based on the information, and then once, I mean, Chrissy, you want to speak to it because this is our person who.
I'm just trying to get a timeline.
Technically, we're supposed to reclassify within 24 hours of having an understanding of what the classification should be. So there's wiggle room there for us to really sit down with the data, assess what the model's showing us in terms of the dilution contours, but even beyond that, all of these sub-areas need to have a legally enforceable line, right? So if it's something that looks a little funny, we might have to tweak it a little bit so that, it points to a landmark that we can easily describe in a legal notice. So all those things have to be teased out, but as soon as we do, it's supposed to happen immediately, and immediately is defined as within 24 hours in the model ordinance.
So once the data comes in, which it sounds like it's still trickling in, but we're probably on the majority end of it coming in, it gets reclassified almost immediately, and that goes into effect right away. We're not talking about something that's going to be impacting next season or a few months from now. We're talking about something in the very near future.
Yes, and when Chrissy says wiggle room, it's not like the last day. As soon as we get the email with the date, the most recent data, we're going to do that within 24 hours. It'll take staff. The wiggle room is, we need a week or two to go through that information, vet it, make sure it all looks up to snuff, and then, it has to be within a reasonable time frame, or otherwise we'd be in hot water with FDA.
Okay. Thank you.
So I will just ask one more question, advocating for our clammers. If the reclassification has not been put into effect yet, and I know that we've had recent tests that the river is good right now, would it be possible to open the river for a week and let the clammers dig out as much as they can?
Again, I will defer to Chrissy. Because the reason I'm deferring is not to pass the buck, but because she is truly the expert on the model ordinance, and I'm kind of a neophyte at it.
I would say the only thing we would have a chance at opening would be the Fox Creek and, the two 5.1 areas that the current data show are outside of the 320 to 1. Because we told FDA when they found us deficient in our dilution assessment, that we would keep it closed until, we have the dilution. Now, that would be based on, as Wayne said, an assumption that this map likely the January and February likely shows the greatest extent of the closure. That's what we're assuming. We don't know that for sure, but we feel relatively confident that the winter months are probably the worst case scenario for extent, and that the October, November, December is not. But having said that, we're going into the winter months, right? And so we're showing that this is the extent in the winter months. So I think we could justify opening 5.1.
But 5.1 would be conditionally open if this reclassification happens, right? So we don't necessarily want to dig those areas out.
Exactly.
I'm talking about the areas that we've been able to harvest from.
Yeah, so we wouldn't be able, when it's in the closed status, we wouldn't be able to harvest. One of the things, so the question, Matt's question about being able to relay into areas that we don't think are vulnerable to this reclassification, we could look at closed data when it's in the closed status. So one of the things when it's with a restricted area, we have a certain standard of fecal coliform standard. When it's in a conditionally approved classification, we would just have to show that when it's in the closed status, those data meet the same standards as restricted. So if we have enough data when the area is closed to show that when it's in the closed status, it meets the standards of a restricted area being in the open status, then we could allow a relay before we officially reclassify it to prohibited. So I just don't know, Matt, if that's something you would want to, endeavor to do, knowing how delicate soft shells are, and it may have low probability of success of them actually surviving being dug up and then replanted, and
Right.
Especially this time of year where we have, the air temperatures are really cold and they'll be vulnerable to being moved.
Yeah, no, I was more thinking of let them go in there now before the official reclassification is. Let them dig 1,000 pounds a day to get the shellfish out of there.
Yeah.
But you're saying that
Because it's
cannot
closed right
happen.
now, right?
Yeah, if we hadn't told the FDA and we're going to keep it closed, but we made that agreement that we're going to keep it closed until, we have this assessment of the dilution contours, so I think we can't go back on that at this point. And I imagine when we do have that meeting with the impacted diggers, as Wayne and Bob said, we've done this already with other communities, and it's a hard pill to swallow, because they're gonna ask, well, wait a minute, what's changed? We ate those clams last year, what's changed? And the problem is nothing's changed. The water quality is the same as it was last year. It's just that we are now having to implement the standards we should have implemented before. And so, but it's a hard pill to swallow, they're like, we've been eating it, people aren't getting sick, and that's gonna be the biggest challenge for communicating that to your community, is that you have this, exceptionally run plant, and you have 2 days worth of holding capacity. So if the plant were to have a catastrophic failure, they could have 48 hours before they even have to discharge partially treated or untreated sewage. So that's the type of data that we're using to say to the FDA and to the auditors, we're not going to listen to the 1,000 to 1. We're going to go to that minimum 320 to 1. Other
Understood.
communities where maybe they couldn't go down to the 320 to 1 because of whatever circumstances, then they could implement other things, whether it's get more holding capacity, or if they are able to go from chlorinated to UV. So UV is much more effective for viruses. But you're already doing all that. You have an exceptionally run plant. And so unfortunately, as Wayne said, that 320 to 1 is not something that we're going to be successful in getting lower than.
But those are the factors that you were talking about that they would need to hear to justify encroaching in on that, is the 2-day holding capacity, the UV, all that stuff. Those are all being brought into play when it comes to the discussion on bringing that back.
It allows us to go to FDA with a straight face and say, given all these factors, we have strong justification not to listen to your 1,000 to 1 dilution ratio and push it back up to the minimum standard.
Okay.
Do you, in that conversation, Bob, do you also use the data like today? We're not, before we were closed, we were digging clams there and eating clams.
Yeah.
And people were okay. Is that some of the
we've used that type of precedent in recent example in the Buzzards Bay area relative to the New Bedford wastewater treatment closure, and there's adjacent aquaculture facilities there who, if we went with 1,000 to 1 closure ratio, that we would have shut those down, and we pushed back to the 320 to 1 with an agreement to do additional testing of the aquaculture beds, and the fact that those businesses had existed for decades and we've never had illnesses from. So that's another line of evidence we can use. That's a little bit more of a weaker line of evidence, because again, they're going to say, and that's great when the plant's working, what happened when it fails? And that's always the
default.
Yeah, the default in the circular argument.
Okay. I want to thank you all for being here. I wish you had more optimistic news, but I also appreciate that you're going to come back in January and that you're open to having a special meeting with our harvesters. These other communities that are impacted for their shellfish beds, I don't know what kind of shellfish they have, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Ipswich provides the majority of soft-shell clams in the state. So this is really important. This is a multi-million-dollar industry here, which we're all very proud of, and we want to maintain it as best we can. So we'll look forward to the next step.
Well,
okay.
we understand that and appreciate the time tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
For coming.